Suppose you're exploring an island you believe is uninhabited, and you find a watch on the ground. What conclusions could you draw? It would be obvious people had been there before, wouldn't it? According to the 19th century philosopher and clergyman William Paley, this simple and innocent seeming example can be worked into a powerful argument for the existence of God. His argument is probably the most famous and influential version of what's come to be known as the design argument, or the teleological argument for God's existence. Paley thinks the watch has specific features that enable us to conclude that it's a designed artifact. And he also thinks that at least some of the things we find in the natural world have those features as well. And so we can conclude that those items have also been designed. But the most likely candidate for having designed nature is God. And so God must exist. So now let's think about the argument in a bit more detail and consider what features of the watch, according to Paley, enable us to conclude that the watch was designed. He contrasts the watch with a stone, and he says that if you had just found a stone on the ground, then for all you could prove, it could have just been there forever. It doesn't require the same kind of explanation as the watch. And the two features of the watch that Paley seems to focus on are its complexity and the fact that it exhibits relationships of purposefulness or function. Obviously, a watch is a very complex machine involving many, many parts, very carefully assembled in order to make the hands go around at a steady pace. And Paley points out that if one minor detail, one tiny part, were altered, the whole watch would cease to function. So each of these very numerous parts are arranged very carefully in order to serve the purpose of causing the hands to go around at a regular pace so that the watch can serve its purpose of telling time. So we've got sort of two elements of purpose here. Each part serves a purpose in making the whole watch function, and also the entire watch serves the purpose of telling time. And it does this in a very complex way. It's already been pointed out, one minor detail changes and the whole thing ceases to function as intended. This has sometimes been referred to as irreducible complexity by later authors. The next point that's important for Paley's argument is that he doesn't seem to think we're just drawing this conclusion about watches based on knowing that watches are produced by humans. He thinks even if you never knew that a watch was produced, even if you've never seen a watch before, you could draw this conclusion. Upon seeing one for the first time, you could examine it for a couple seconds, and based on the fact that it's a really complex machine and you have these purposeful relationships going on, you could conclude that it's designed by someone. So, for example, imagine somebody that was part of a tribal community, one of these remote tribes that's like separated from modern society and technologies, never seen anything like a watch before. And now they find a watch on the ground. Wouldn't they be able to tell that this was an item that was produced by humans? And it seems like a fair point Paley's making here. It seems obvious that they would. And so, according to Paley, the way that you explain that is by positing that the watch has features that would enable anyone to tell that it's a designed artifact in and of itself. Now, when we carry the analogy over to natural objects, according to Paley, we find that those same features are present. We normally take them for granted. We don't notice that things around us have this remarkable complexity and that they have this sort of purpose-serving capacities in relation to each other. It's as if we are like the remote tribal people. But imagine that they've lived in a place where somebody else has come in and placed like watches all over the place, and for a long time they just think of these as things that are always there. But one day, if someone does consider it carefully and they look at these things, and they would draw the conclusion, well, somebody placed this here, somebody designed this object, and it'd be a justifiable conclusion. What are the objects around us that Paley's saying are like this? he uses the phrase organized parts of nature to describe them. And his favorite examples are biological examples. Something like a flower has, these parts that are quite intricate when you examine them closely. And each part sort of serves a purpose to make the whole thing work, to get the flower water. It has, these veins that draw water up through the roots and into the rest of the plant. It has these flowers that attract bees and so on. So it's got complexity, and it's got these sort of purpose-serving relationships. His favorite example is the eye. An animal has an eye that's many millions of times more complex than a watch, and it serves a purpose for that animal. Say you have a deer, and it's able to navigate its surroundings because of its eyes. It enables it to navigate. So you've got the same thing according to Paley. You've got complexity on a much higher scale, and you have purpose relationships. Now, clearly, you have purpose relationships from the part to the whole, according to Paley. The eye of the deer enables the deer to see. It's for the deer to see. That's the purpose of it having an eye. And then when you look on the whole, maybe we don't have such a clear case. What's the purpose of the deer as a whole, the organism? That's less clear, but still you have purpose. For Paley, purpose implies intentionality, some kind of intelligence behind the purpose. When something serves a purpose, to say that it does that is just to say that someone intended for it to serve that purpose. So the watch is foretelling time. It can only be foretelling time because somebody designed it to tell time with that purpose in mind. So if purpose implies intention and intelligence, then we can draw this conclusion, right, that there must be an intention and or intelligence behind these parts of nature. So let me now turn to an analysis of the argument and an evaluation. First of all, what is the argument supposed to be proving? We should note that the argument only aims to establish that a designer God exists. Paley's aware it doesn't prove that God is morally perfect, all-knowing, a loving being. It doesn't prove any of the details of the Christian God specifically, no more than any other religion. In fact, there was a somewhat popular movement in Paley's time towards what is called deism, which was the belief in sort of what's sometimes called a clockmaker God. And deists believe that there must be some sort of intelligence behind the universe that's worthy of the name God, but they didn't specifically believe that it had the features of, say, the Christian God or any other religion. It's just a being that sort of starts up the universe like winding up a watch and then steps aside and lets things go. Paley's aware that this is really the most that this argument can establish at this point, and he seems to think that maybe some further argument could establish the details more. Still in all, this limited nature of the conclusion can be turned into a potential criticism of the argument, and many have commented that at most we should accept the conclusion only that the least godlike being necessary to design the objects in question exists, right? That's the most that it proves. This being, whoever designed the flowers and the eye and so on, it wouldn't necessarily be perfect. So then, is it clear that it would be worthy of the name God if it's just a being that designed flowers and eyes, but it's not a perfect being? At the same time, would it even have to be supernatural? Why couldn't it be something within the natural world? I mean, in the movie Prometheus, it turns out that all life on Earth is designed by aliens, so it could be some sort of aliens that designed things like the flower and the eye. Of course, then you have the issue of saying, what designed the aliens then? And someone might assert, well, if they are beings complex enough to design flowers and deer and things like that, then they themselves would have features of being designed. However, there's sort of a problem with that move though, because if you're saying that, why does moving to the supernatural world sort of halt this regress? If you're saying that the you know the aliens that designed the eye and the flower, they themselves must have been complex enough to have been designed by something and purposeful enough to have been designed by something, and then we have to say what designed them. Could it be further aliens? And if we've got a regress going, why does it stop the regress to say it was a supernatural being? I mean, wouldn't the same reasoning apply if there's a supernatural being that designed the flower and the eye and so on? And according to this argument, in order to design things like that, you have to be complex and purposeful, have purposeful relationships yourself. Well, then we would get this sort of problem of what designed God, right? If you're saying anything that can design flowers and eyes itself has to be designed. So then what designed God? On the other hand, if you're not saying that, then it could be aliens that designed the flower and the eye, and no reason to conclude that they themselves had to be designed by something else. So that's a criticism that arises from consideration of the nature of the conclusion of the argument. Now, let's turn to some general comments about the nature of the argument itself. And it falls into two categories. One is that it's an argument by analogy, and the second is that it's an example of what philosophers sometimes call inference to the best explanation. So, first, it's an analogy between a watch and various parts of nature, specifically biological mechanisms. Also, it's an analogy between arguments. The argument about the watch, where you conclude this is designed by something, and the argument about biological mechanisms. The second category that it falls into is that it's an inference to the best explanation. Now, what do I mean by that? An inference to the best explanation is an argument where you have some data or observations, and then you're looking at competing theories that explain the data. Some are better than others, and you conclude that one of them is in fact true. So what makes some explanations better than others? Let me give you an example where it's really obvious that one explanation is better. When I was a kid, say I think I was about 10 years old, my brother Pat was 8, and he stole some money from my dad. There was $300 bills on a table, and Pat took them. And at some point later, my dad is presented with a few observations, a few pieces of data. The money was gone from the table, and then he shortly found out that Pat has $300 bills, and so the explanation that Pat took the money comes to mind. Pat, however, had a competing explanation. Pat offered another explanation of the same sort of observation. So Pat said, the reason why I have the $300 bills is I mowed the lawn for an old man who lives around the block, and he's mostly blind. And he asked me to mow his lawn, and when I was done, he reached in his wallet and he took out what he thought were three $10 bills, but it was actually $300 bills. And he didn't see because he's mostly blind, see? And he gave me the $300 bills, and so, that's how I got these $300 bills. That's the explanation of that. So this explanation was pretty ridiculous, right? And it's rejected immediately. And Pat gets in trouble for taking the money. It's pretty clear that the other explanation is better. What's better about it? Well, one issue is completeness. Pat's story doesn't explain what happened to the money on the table. So the explanation that says he took the money on the table explains how he got $300 bills. It also explains how $300 bills are missing from the table. Um, there's another thing about this explanation. It has the potential to be predictive of further observations. Now, at the time, if you'd said, well, I bet if you took fingerprints from the money that Pat has, it's also got Dad's fingerprints on it, right? And then you go take those fingerprints and you find out, in fact, yeah, it does have those fingerprints. So the theory, like, predicted another observation that you would find, and that makes it better. Another feature that makes an explanation better is that it is, in a way, simpler. Now, when I say simpler, it's important to understand, I don't mean simpler as in easier to understand. It's not necessarily that it's easier to understand. It's that it involves fewer sort of uncorroborated assumptions. Pat's story involves all kinds of things we'd never heard of before. There's this old man who lives around the block and he's mostly blind, but he still hires kids to mow his lawn and pays them out of his wallet. And it's kind of convoluted in the sense that it involves a lot of these assumptions that are sort of, they're uncorroborated in a sense. They're not, we had no independent reason for thinking any of these things were true. So a theory is better the less it involves that sort of thing. And this ties in with a kind of anti-surprise factor. A theory is better if it's not very surprising, exciting, if it's kind of boring, actually. So, if somebody's telling you some stuff and it's boring you, that probably increases the likelihood that it's true. If someone's telling you things that's very exciting and oh my God, it's amazing and it's exciting and it's fantastic, or terrifying, it decreases the likelihood that it's true. Actually, the truth is usually pretty boring, and so you can see where the theory that Pat just took that money is so much better than the theory about there was this old guy who lived around the block and gave him $300 bills, thinking that they were three $10 bills. On all of these factors, that theory is a pretty bad one. We should note how Paley's argument is different from the cosmological argument, which we talked about before. The cosmological argument addresses the question, why is there anything at all? And the cosmological argument asserts that if there's anything in existence, a universe, even a stone, then you need to postulate where that came from, and ultimately you will end up concluding that God must be where everything came from. This is not that argument. The design argument is, why is there something like this specific thing, this biological mechanism, or whatever it is you have? And another important difference is that in the cosmological argument, God is the only possible explanation. Where did the universe come from? And then it's asserted that only the existence of God could explain where the universe as a whole came from, or why there's something rather than nothing. Versus the design argument, where we're not saying God's the only possible explanation. The argument is that God's the best and most likely explanation, but it's not the only possible explanation. So now, if we're evaluating the argument, we can evaluate as an analogy, and we can also evaluate as an inference to the best explanation. Let's start with evaluating it as an analogy. So an analogy is, when you get down to it, a comparison between two things. And you're saying that they are similar in certain respects, and so you're concluding that they will be similar in another way. And what makes an argument like this stronger is that if you have similarities that are relevant to the conclusion, and the more the better. If you have similarities that are not so relevant to the conclusion, then that doesn't really count in favor of the argument. And if you have dissimilarities that are relevant to the conclusion, well, that counts against the argument. So let's take an example of an analogy or a comparison between two things that's a really weak one. Suppose somebody's comparing two cars, Al's car and Bob's car, and they say, well, Al's car is very much similar to Bob's car. They're both blue, and they both have leather seats. So Bob's car gets good gas mileage, and since Al's car is really similar, I'm betting Al's car gets good gas mileage too. You can see that's not a very good argument, right? Now think about what makes that bad. The similarity of them both being blue, them both having leather seats, has nothing to do with the similarity that you're concluding that they'll get similar gas mileage. Also, if there are dissimilarities, I mean, let's say the cars that we're talking about, one is like a Toyota Prius, and then Bob's car is a Toyota Prius, and then Al's got this really similar car. It's blue with leather seats, but it's a Ford Mustang. That type of engine, right? Those different cars have makes one being a sports car in general are dissimilarities that are relevant to the question of gas mileage, and so that would count against that argument. In addition to the fact that the similarities that were pointed to are not um, are not relevant to gas mileage. So how does Paley's argument fare? Um, One criticism of the argument comes from a philosopher who actually discussed this argument before Paley had discussed it, and that's David Hume. And according to Hume, the argument is a weak analogy. He discussed an argument that's at least very similar about 50 years or 70 years before Paley made the argument. And Paley doesn't say anything about Hume's commentary. It's sort of unknown whether he even knew about it or he had read it. According to Hume, you're drawing conclusions about cause and effect when you make this analogy, and they're based on experience. Hume's philosophy is all about experience and how our empirical experiences enable us to draw conclusions, and he has much to say about the relationship of cause and effect and how we come to the conclusion that one thing causes another. But according to Hume, when you're drawing this type of conclusion, the more experience you have with the items in question, with the things you're talking about, then the better, and the less you have, then the worse. So for Hume, he says that if you're drawing a conclusion about something like a watch or a house, you have experience with those types of things, and you know that a watch is something that's designed and constructed by humans, whereas you know that a stone is something that humans don't design and construct, and you can make these kind of comparisons. For Hume, making these kind of comparisons plays a big role in this type of argument. And when you turn to nature itself, or especially if you turn to like the entire universe and say, well, the entire universe is the kind of thing that was designed and constructed. According to Hume, there's a vast difference. So there's a huge dissimilarity in the analogy. When we examine a watch and draw a conclusion about it, that's something that we're very familiar with, and we have experience of those types of things. So we can draw this type of conclusion. This one was designed, this one was not. When you turn to, say, for instance, the entire universe, which is in Hume's argument, he's considering that God is postulated as the designer of the entire universe, and he says we haven't any experience with universes. Looking at, well, here's a universe that was designed and created, but here's another universe that wasn't. We don't have any way of doing that. We only live in one universe. There's only one universe for us to experience. So the analogy is very weak because we don't have the same kind of experience that enables us to judge whether a universe is designed or not, that we do with like a particular item in the universe, like a watch versus a stone. So to a certain extent, this might apply to Paley's analogy. However, Paley's pointing to a specific item or a number of specific items like an eye or a flower and saying these things have the elements of design. Can't we put something like the eye into a category of it's a particular item that we're looking at, and couldn't we ask, is it more similar to the watch or is it more similar to the stone? Never mind the part about the whole universe. Maybe Hume could say that there's still a big difference because we're familiar with things like watches in general and sort of how they're produced. Whereas when we look at items of nature, there's less of a familiarity with how something like that might have been produced. So maybe there's some element of this criticism that applies even to Paley's specific version of the argument. Paley, of course, could deny, and he seems to deny, that the reasoning about the watch comes from experience, or at least that it needs to come from experience. He says that even if you have no experience of a watch, and I give you the example of the people from the remote tribe, and they conclude that this watch is designed and created by other people, but at least they would have some experience with produced items, artifacts, versus things that grow and so on. So there might still be quite a dissimilarity that interferes with drawing this comparison between the watch and something like the eye. So maybe Hume's criticism has some strength here. On the other hand, if we turn to evaluating the design argument as an inference to the best explanation, and ask, well, first of all, what is it explaining? It's explaining the appearance that you have these sort of purposeful relationships when we look at a flower, when we look at the eye, and that's combined with the sort of complexity that's involved. So you have a complex mechanism that's delivering some sort of service for a purpose. And Paley says, what other explanation is there? The other explanation he considers is that these items just arose by chance, purely by chance. So, I mean, the idea that, a watch just emerged by chance, just like, I don't know, waves are like washing up on the rocks or something, and then, one day they've worn away the rocks in such a way that they come together to form this watch, is clearly sort of absurd. And so Paley's saying, well, that's if it's not by design, then it would have to be by chance. And this sort of brings up maybe the biggest objection, the most common objection to the design argument, which has to do with evolution. And the objection is that evolution provides a better explanation of the observations, the data that Paley's talking about, than design. This could also be thought of as a dissimilarity in the analogy. In the case of the argument about biological mechanisms, there's a better explanation, whereas, in the case of the argument about the watch, there is no better explanation. So without going into an entire discussion on evolution here, and sort of like rehearsing all the evidence for evolution, let me just point out a few things about it. First, there's a difference between saying things that these biological mechanisms arose by evolution and saying that they arose by chance. Evolution does involve chance or randomness in some sense and at some levels. The essential idea behind evolution is that organisms pass on their traits to their offspring, and over the course of many generations, the frequency of traits changes according to the organisms that have produced more offspring. So whereas within a population, you have a variety of different traits, and if there's one trait that is more conducive to survival and reproduction, then you see that trait in the future generations because their ancestors have produced more offspring. It involves chance to a certain extent because evolution involves mutation. A mutation is a change in the genetic code of an organism that it passes on to its offspring. So from one generation to the next, there's a mutation, and a mutation introduces variation into the gene pool. So there's a certain amount of chance involved in a certain sense. It doesn't necessarily mean that there's something that's random in the sort of ultimate sense of randomness, that there is no cause or explanation whatsoever for why this mutation occurred. There are, could very well be explanations for why all mutations occur. Could have to do with, photons affecting the DNA, that as the organism is reproducing itself, events at a microscopic level that could still be completely deterministic. Although there's some reason to think it isn't always. There's nothing about mutation occurring that means that anything happens for no reason. You could completely believe in Leibniz's principle of sufficient reason, that everything has an explanation, that everything happens for a reason, and still subscribe to the theory of evolution, where mutations happen, quote unquote, by chance, but they needn't be by chance in the ultimate sense of having no explanation whatsoever. They could be by chance purely in the sense that we are incapable of cataloging the sort of reasons why they occur. Just like when you roll a set of dice, we say that the result is by chance, but of course, it's not necessarily by chance in the ultimate sense of it. Like, there's a reason why your arm sort of turned in that way exactly when you rolled those dice, which led to you getting snake eyes or whatever it was. So it's only by chance in the sense that the explanation of why things unfolded in that way is difficult or impossible for us to trace. So there's a certain element of chance or randomness in evolution, in that it requires mutation, but that is not chance in the sort of ultimate sense of something that's ultimately random. And furthermore, it's all the other aspects of evolutionary theory are not random at all. There's a very law-like sort of progression. It could even be stated, and sometimes has been stated, that like if you understood evolution completely and you had a being that was capable of processing all of the information about everything in the universe at sort of the moment that life began, then such a being would be able to predict everything that happens throughout the course of evolution, and that it all followed in a law-like manner. Of course, we don't have all that information, and so we're perhaps forever incapable of making like wide-scale predictions about how evolution will unfold over the next several million years, but it's possible in principle. So the idea of these complex and purposefully related biological mechanisms arising from evolution is not really comparable to the idea of them arising by sort of sheer chance, like as in waves washing up on rocks until you have a watch there, or just sort of random elements combining until like you get an eye of a deer or something like that. That's really not what evolution is like. So now let's turn to the claim of evolution being superior to design as an explanation, and it fares better on all of the criteria that I went over when comparing explanations. It's simpler. Of course, it's not simpler in the sense easier to understand. It's very easy to understand. God put it there. But it's simpler in the sense of involving fewer uncorroborated assumptions. The mechanisms of evolution are not just postulated to explain this phenomenon that Paley's talking about. They're also independently confirmed that natural selection happens, and that it changes the frequency of traits in a population is something that's directly observed. And in the fossil record, showing organisms historically are arising in a succession from simpler to more complex is also confirmed. So there are very few uncorroborated assumptions there, whereas the design hypothesis, if you will, postulates this completely separate world from the natural world, and that adds a lot into like sort of what you are asked to believe in order for this explanation to work. In other words, Paley's explanation appeals to a supernatural being that designed these things. If there can be an explanation that doesn't involve that and explains how this arose within the natural world, that's preferable. That's simpler in the relevant sense of simpler. Of course, not simpler as in easier to understand. It's also more complete and predicts other findings, right? The theory of evolution enables us to make predictions about things we will find if we look into the DNA of various organisms. And there are numerous cases. I don't not going to try to rehearse a list of them, of predictions that you would expect to find. You would expect to find chimpanzees to have such and such a DNA component, and that's predicted because of our evolutionary connection with them, before it's actually confirmed that you can look at the DNA and find out that sure they do have it. And there are numerous cases like that. And having this understanding of how natural selection works and how artificial selection also works and enables us to manipulate our surroundings in all kinds of ways. It has applications, right? It enables us to create vaccines, to use artificial selection to culture microorganisms. We can use this to make better beer and all kinds of things. And so, as far as being more complete and predicting other findings, it's way ahead. The surprise factor, that one is a little bit hard to compare. I suppose it depends how surprised would you be, or how surprised should you be to find out there's a supernatural world in addition to the natural world. Certainly evolution has that advantage that it doesn't appeal to a supernatural world in order to explain the physical world. Another point about evolution is that, setting aside the issue about explaining these observations that Paley has made, we have, when I say we, I mean not being biologists, not being people who explore the evidence for evolution and all the details of evolution, that we have the fact that there are biologists who do, as a reason to think that evolution is true. When we talked about the argument of appeal to expertise or authority, when certain conditions are met, there's nothing wrong with this type of argument. When you're talking about experts in the appropriate field, and when the experts agree, they don't have to agree 100%, but if they agree to a large extent, and you do have agreement about evolution among biologists, it can be safely said that over 95% of biologists agree that evolution in one form or another is the explanation of the various complex life forms on Earth. And it's an area of genuine established knowledge. And so those conditions being met, there's a good reason for non-experts to believe that evolution is true independently of the question of, how do we explain where these complex mechanisms come from? So if it's already true, if we already have a reason to believe it, and it explains where these complex mechanisms come from, well, then there's no need to appeal to another explanation. And so the design argument for the existence of God fails. Notice that this is an objection to the argument rather than a counter argument. The argument fails to prove its conclusion, is the point. It's not that it somehow proves God doesn't exist. Now let's look at potential responses. A lot of people's response, well, doesn't design need to be invoked anyway? Even though evolution is true, don't we still need design? And I guess the idea sometimes isn't evolution a very precise and complex process? And so don't doesn't don't we need a designer to explain this evolutionary process? And this is really the beauty of the evolutionary theory, is that it doesn't involve complexity from the very outset. The process starts with relatively simple items. You just need sort of appropriate chemical conditions for molecules to interact in the right way, and you get like proteins, and you get these fairly simple, like single-celled organisms, and that develops into these much more complex organisms. Now, when we looked at the initial argument from Paley, he contrasted the watch with something like a stone. In other words, he's not making the argument that, look, everything, no matter how simple, requires an explanation. So sometimes, if people say, well, okay, you start with these sort of simple chemical compounds, and then you get your evolutionary chain started that leads to these complex things. But where do the compounds come from, right? Where does that come from? And the thing is, when you do that, you're actually switching over to a different argument. You're switching over to basically the cosmological argument, because at this point you're saying, well, there's got to be an answer to where that comes from, even if it's simple, and where does the next thing come from? And that's another argument. But here we're just talking about the design argument. That's the cosmological argument at that point, which we've covered before. So in order for this to be specifically a design argument, the point has to be that there's something special about certain items, that they have this complexity and this purpose-related activity. And so then there's a second point there. If evolution gives rise to purposeful relationships, teleological relationships, to use a fancy word, doesn't that anyhow require an intending intelligence, right? Earlier, Paley seems to think there's a connection between something having a purpose and an intelligence wanting or designing that thing or intending that thing to have that purpose. So if those are just conceptually connected up, then it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if evolution starts with simpler items, because you've got purpose. You've got, the eye is for seeing. It doesn't matter if it evolved from simpler things. That implies intentionality. One thing to point out is that it's not been universally agreed that things having purposes necessarily means that there's an intelligence or intentionality behind them serving that purpose. Aristotle's probably the most famous teleologist of all time. Aristotle thought that science would proceed in terms of investigating the purposes of things, but he never actually relates it to an intentionality or an intelligence behind it that intends for it to have that purpose, and at least not clearly. Many interpreters think of Aristotle as just thinking objects in nature have purposes, and that's it. They just do. So it's possible to have a view where things have purposes without, being designed for a purpose. And secondly, we should also make a sharp distinction between something serving a purpose and something having that as its purpose, right? Like, obviously, you can take a book and you can use it to hold up a window. That doesn't mean that the purpose of a book is to hold up a window. It's serving that purpose. But now, what if the only kinds of purposes that there ever were the latter, things serving purposes, not having that as their purpose, but actually serving that purpose? They just happen to serve that purpose. Now, we actually struggle to see this difference. There's some psychological evidence that when you compare the statements, this deer has eyes so that it can see, and compare that with the statement, this deer has eyes and they enable it to see. Most people won't even really see a distinction between those two statements unless you really kind of focus on it. We tend to see things that serve a purpose as being like for that purpose, but that isn't necessarily the case. But anyhow, setting aside the issue of exactly how we define purpose and the difference between saying something has a purpose and just saying it just does that thing, it serves that purpose, intentionality, either way, is exactly what evolution emphatically does not require. So either we have to think of function as not requiring an intending intelligence, or else we think of biological structures should not as having functions, but they simply do something. They serve a function because they're descended from structures that happen to do it and which gave those ancestral organisms a reproductive advantage. So it's not that the deer has an eye so that it can see. It's just that its ancient ancestors happen to have something closer to an eye that enabled them to navigate, somewhat, and then that developed throughout millions of years. The eye doesn't actually have seeing as its purpose. It just so happens that it does that for the deer, and that's all there is to say about it. And this is what makes evolution such a powerful objection to the design argument, because it shows how you can have something that appears to have a purpose without it actually being the case that it was designed for that purpose. Now, Paley actually anticipated a similar kind of objection, although the theory of evolution in its current form was not around in his time. He did anticipate that maybe someone would say that the complexity and purposeful relationships that we find in the natural world just are a result of some sort of laws of nature. And he compares it to somebody saying about the watch that the watch just arose from laws of a metallic nature. And he has two responses to this. The first response is, he says, if there are laws, then there's a lawgiver anyway. So anyhow, my argument ends up being true, right? If these things resulted from biological laws, well, then who made the laws? And this is just a confusion about the word laws, right? I mean, it's an equivocation or a conflation of definitions, a confusion about definitions, right? There's a difference between a prescriptive law and a descriptive law. A prescriptive law is somebody makes a law and says you should do this, or you have to do this, or else I will punish you, right? The government makes such laws. But there are also descriptive laws. The kind of laws that are investigated by science are descriptive laws. They're not laws that somebody makes and insists that you have to follow them or you get punished. They're laws that describe like how things work, how things always work. Like, we talk about the law of gravity. It doesn't mean that there's somebody who made a law, you all you planets, you have to be attracted to other planets and move towards them. It doesn't mean that, right? To say it's a law of gravity. It's just to say it's a description of how these things actually behave. So laws of biology are not prescriptive laws. They would be descriptive laws. So this response doesn't really work. And the second thing that Paley says is that no one ever saw a watch formed by laws of a metallic nature. In other words, he's saying it's just not likely that laws of a biological nature or laws of nature would lead to such a complex, interrelated sort of mechanisms that you see, right? No more than it's likely that if you saw a watch, that it would be explained by some kind of laws of the metallic nature. But here again, when he says it's unlikely, we know now that it's very likely that laws of biological nature can give rise to these sort of complex organisms. And, it's true that laws of a metallic nature don't give rise to watches. Laws of a metallic nature would just be sort of combining and recombining like metallic elements, and they're not just going to randomly combine into a watch. So it's again because he's thinking of the alternative as just pure randomness that he's thinking this is an unlikely, this objection is unlikely. But when it comes to the actual mechanisms he's pointing out as organized works of nature, it is likely that natural laws have given rise to them. Now, the last point to be made about this argument, a lot of times people will point out, isn't it possible that God exists along with evolution? So that, yes, the complex mechanisms we're looking at arose through evolution, but that is like part of God's plan. And of course, prima facie, obviously it is possible that they coexist. There's no immediate reason to think that evolution happening is contrary to the existence of God. Although I said some have argued that it does make it unlikely that God exists. Namely, Richard Dawkins has argued that. But again, the point is that this is not meant to be a counter argument disproving the claim that God exists. It's meant to say if you don't assume at the outset that God exists, and you use this design argument as a premise to get to that conclusion, the fact that these mechanisms evolved from simpler ones interferes with drawing that conclusion. It creates a barrier to drawing that conclusion. It's not that it disproves the conclusion. Now someone could say God is also the explanation. Like, okay, evolution does explain how these things came about, but God's also involved in that, so God's also part of the explanation. And the thing is that you could say that may not be incompatible with what's been said, but it's not justified because it's superfluous to say that you have one explanation, but then you can add this other thing in that's not necessary. It's like saying the wind explains why the door slammed shut, but I think also there was like a ninja that slammed it shut. So to sum things up here, I think there's basically two ways that you can look at Paley's design argument. He explicitly states it as an analogy, but it's also an inference to the best explanation. And there are two kind of main lines of criticism of the argument. One is to criticize the analogy. That's sort of the Humean approach. And the second approach to criticizing the argument is to look at better explanations, namely evolution. So I hope this helped you to get a better understanding of the design argument for the existence of God. This is the main kind of argument that falls under that category, the most influential one, the most famous one. Looking forward to questions or comments about it, and I'll talk to you soon.